All right, lovely. So thank you guys for joining us, and all my students here in the Zoom call, as well as those that are joining us on Facebook Live or watching this on YouTube. This just to give you guys a quick introduction. This is a part of the career crafting series that we're holding at Vishwajot. The genesis of this course came about because all of us felt that there wasn't really good advice offered to us when we were getting ready to make the big decisions in life. And we looked around and asked our students, and we found out that this continues to be the case even today. People are either told what they have to do, that I have imagined you to be a doctor or an engineer, or they're told, "Bacha, just go follow your dream." And what we felt is that neither of these are real. Are really good ways of thinking about it, and therefore we came up with sort of a Venn diagram born out of a simplification of a Japanese principle called Ikigai, which basically is saying that in order to make a good decision, you should think about what you are passionate about, yes, what your dreams are, what you're passionate about, your purpose, also what you are good at doing. So what is your competitive advantage, and it shouldn't all be internal. You should also then look externally and see what the world finds valuable, and therefore to make your decision based on all of these three things. And to help us in this journey, we've been chatting with, or to make this a lot more real, we've been chatting with real successful people, and one such is with us here today. So this is Mridvika, who's joined us, and Mridvika is currently the MD of a company called Shortlist, and they're recruitment tech company. Not only is she a CEO, she also has a view on how the industry is changing. So what we want to do for our students is to use both those perspectives to get to help them think more clearly about what they want to do. So thanks, Mrids, for taking the time out and joining us.
Thank you so much for having me over here. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to your students.
Okay, lovely. So, could you just start us off? If you had to think about your journey, what right now we are seeing that you're the MD, you're the CEO, you're the big boss of an organization. But one is not just born into that, right? Like, and there has been a journey that has brought you here. So if you could talk about it just from the points of view of turning points through your life. So starting from when you were a child all the way up to now, if you can think about what were pivotal moments in your life that looking back now, obviously then you may not have known that they were pivotal, but looking back now, if you were to look back now, you might find that these are the things that sort of allowed me to become who I am today. And if you could talk a little bit about your journey through those moments and through those decisions that you took through your life, and that might help all of us gain some understanding about your journey and about how to think.
Sure. Thanks, Amrut. I'd absolutely be happy to talk about that. So I actually come from a small desert town in Rajasthan called Bikaner, born in a family where parents were government servants. I have a younger sibling. And the times that I was growing up, which was early 90s, was you were considered successful when you could either follow an engineering path or a medicine path. And I had seen doctors in my family. My father and my chacha both are doctors, and I was scared at the sight of blood, and was and never wanted to sort of go into medicine, which is how by default I chose to become an engineer with no real passion for making things or figuring out anything deeper in engineering. I was a good student all along, which helped me, pass out from engineering with good grades. But I really never saw myself coding and debugging code for the rest of my life. So after I completed engineering, I did get a job in an IT services firm, and I worked there for 2 years. And those 2 years that I was working over there, I was servicing a client that was in the US, and I was running test cases. I was, debugging some code, but with no real understanding of why I was doing what I was doing. I was doing something because someone asked me to do so, and I did not really understand what would be the impact of me changing a line of code here or there. And I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. And so I wanted to understand how technology can impact business decisions. And therefore I was looking for, okay, let me go study something that allows me to, figure that out. So I went to the US and took up a course in Indiana University in information systems. And that course was based in a business school that allowed me to understand how technology plays a role in building organization or even growing an organization. After I finished that course, I got recruited in a consulting firm called Ernst & Young in their New York office. And over there, my role was to work with clients and help them understand how technology systems impact their business decisions. Now that was a little bit more closer to where the action was. I was able to see how changing things in their systems was leading to different outcomes for their business. However, it was still further away from the kind of impact that I was looking to make. And I did that for 2 to 3 years, and then got very disillusioned early on in my career and wanted to come back to India. This was again in 2009, 2010, when I decided that I will come back to India, but I will do something in education. I think the reason I chose education was largely because my mother's been a educator herself for several years. She was a professor in English literature, and she also worked in a lot of projects with UNICEF and World Bank with government of Rajasthan. And when I used to come back from the US to India on my vacation, I used to see how she used to be going from one village to the other, one taluka to the other. And I looked at the state of education in India, in a country which has the maximum youth, which then translates into maximum potential. It felt almost criminal to not have these students have access to education that would lead them to utilize their potential. And so one thing that was clear was I wanted to work in education. And so when I came back to India, I started exploring opportunities in the non-profit sector, which is how Teach for India happened. Now, like the pivotal moments that you asked me to think about was choosing engineering, coming to Bombay to pursue that engineering. That led me to the US, and then from US I came back to India, and then chose a career in non-profit sector in education. Now, if you ask any rational person, none of these are supposed to be the part of plan, or right. This is not a very traditional career trajectory that an average middle class student would follow, like myself. But I think each of these decisions, now that I look back in retrospect, helped me be who I am and helped me, come closer to exploring my passion and identifying what I'm most passionate about.
Right. So, that's interesting. If you can, so we have a couple of questions from our students, and you've talked a little bit about this, but Nidhi wanted to know more about your social environment growing up. So you mentioned you were not from the city like Mumbai. You were from a small town, and your parents were working with government in some way. But if you could talk about how that social environment is, let's say, different from the environment your boys are being raised in, and what is the contrast there, that might help Nidhi sort of put that in perspective.
Sure, Nidhi, great question. I think I can't even compare the two environments, because I think I have I have two 7-year-old twin boys, which is what Amrut's referring to. But I was growing up in Bikaner, and it was we were staying in government quarters. I had a younger brother. My parents were in 9-to-5 jobs. My father was in a medical department of government of Rajasthan, and my mother used to work in a government college as a professor of English literature. That's what we were exposed to. Growing up, we had a very normal childhood. We went to the English medium schools in the city, and grew up playing outside with kids, which my kids would never know what that means. And so the social fabric actually constituted to a lot of values and rigor that that I think my brother and I grew up with. Our school was a very normal school, which taught English as a medium of instruction, but the exposure that we had to things outside of where we were living was very, very limited. So I never knew that there could be careers outside of being an engineer or being a doctor. Those were probably the two professions that that people thought if you took, you would be considered successful. I never knew that chartered accountancy or taking commerce as a line of education could lead you to becoming a chartered accountant. I never knew that studying journalism could make you could put you on a path of becoming a journalist or a reporter. So the exposure to careers, exposure to what jobs existed was very, very limited growing up in a small town. Also, the place where I grew up, like a lot of my friends from that time got married early on. It is imagine a small town in Rajasthan where after you've completed your 12th grade or you're just about entering your first year of graduation, girls did get married off, and I'm talking about like early 90s or mid 90s. So that was essentially
And once they got married off, you mean they got married and then they were only at home, or they just got married and then they continued to
some of them did
something?
pursue. I mean, it all depends on the environment and the familial support that they got after they got married. But some of them completed their degree courses while being married as either a distance learning thing. Some of them got kids pretty early on as well, and some of them became entrepreneurs. Some of them chose to become homemakers. So there was a variety of different things that happened for girls my age growing up in a small town. So I find myself extremely lucky to basically have been born in a family that could encourage the ambitions, or encourage or provide the exposure that I was looking for, that allowed me to further hone in on my own potential.
So should we start with that first decision of how did you decide on Bombay, to leave Bikaner, come to Bombay? What drove that decision, and how did that change the trajectory that you think you would have been on if you hadn't taken that decision?
Yeah, so I had so typically what people do after 12th grade is they take these competitive exams, and like everyone else, I had taken a lot of these competitive exams from JEE. I don't know what it's called now. I think they've all these nomenclatures have changed, but the entrance exams to IIT, I had taken entrance exams to triple IIT, or in Rajasthan it used to be called as PET, which is the pre-engineering test. So I took all of these different exams, and I secured a couple of seats in Rajasthan as well. And then I went with my father to look at different colleges, and I saw the colleges and met with the professors, and I looked at my dad and I said, I don't think I want to be here, just because, not just because of the infrastructure that I saw in the colleges, but I think I just felt the need to get wider exposure to the world. And And Bombay, I chose Bombay because I think I used to visit Bombay. My aunt, my Masi used to live here, and every summer vacation I used to come here, and I used to see kids around over here. The level of confidence they had, the exposure they had to things, in general was just like generations apart. And so I think I was always attracted to the big city life because I never had that myself. And so I wanted to come and live here to experience what it means to be studying in a big city. So that's how I landed up in Bombay, and I lived with my Masi for 4 years of my engineering. And those 4 years exposed me to a different world of education altogether. Like in Rajasthan, a lot of my friends who went to engineering there didn't need to attend classes, or they basically finish their engineering with limited exposure. And Bombay allowed me to sort of break out of that pigeonhole of some sorts, and got a little bit more exposed to the city life here.
And then your thirst for exposure just increased, right? So you then said that I now want to go to the US. So can you talk about that decision? Why did you take that decision? What was going on through your mind? And what about it worked? What didn't play out as you imagined?
So when I was in 4th year of engineering, I attempted a lot of different and a lot of like these entrance. They are not called entrance. They are called these company exams that allow you to get placed at companies right after college. And I have no shame in accepting that no company wanted to take me. It was after the 7th or the 8th attempt that I actually cleared an aptitude exam of one of the companies, and for those 12 to 15 weeks when placement season was on in our college, everyone from TCS to Infosys to Capgemini to Amdocs, you think of every big corporate IT company in India rejected me because I couldn't clear their aptitude test. And that basically was one of the starters of my disagreements with the standardized tests, because they don't necessarily allow for an individual's potential or talent to be tested in the right way.
Right.
So I did get placed at one company said, let's give her a job. So I did get a job after college, and I joined that company. And I was there for 2 years as a software engineer and then senior software engineer. But again, as Amrut said, like I always asked for questions like, why? And I didn't feel that my questions were answered. Every piece of code that I was being asked to write, and I said, why? But what would this exactly do on the business side of things? How will it change their business outcomes? Does it mean that they are going to get more clients, or does it mean they're going to get more customers because I do this versus that? And it just no one was able to answer those questions. And I saw a career trajectory of a lot of software engineers. It went on from being one level to the other and second level to the other, and there's nothing wrong in that. It's just that I didn't feel that I would be able to do that for rest of my life, because as I'd mentioned, engineering happened to be by chance. I had no real passion for coding. I had no real passion for creating software code. So I didn't see see myself doing that for a very, very long time, which is how I.
But then why US? I mean, you could do many other things. Why did you choose to go to the US, and what was your thought process at that time?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think I had a few friends who had gone to the US right after they completed their engineering, and I was in touch with them. And when I spoke to them about, how their experiences were in the university setting over there, I got a lot of insight as to, how they were shocked, because over there, no professor came in and asked you, wrote something on the board and asked you to,
Copy it.
just copy it.
Right.
But every single lecture was just a discussion. Like you would have to read papers, and you would have to read articles and come in, and you would have to bring in your point of view into the classroom. And everything just was a discussion. There were even the exams that they used to attempt were like open book exams, like because knowledge is not scarce anymore, right? Like you can find information. I think it is how you apply that information makes all the difference.
Right.
So they were doing that, and I was fascinated just hearing that. And so I wanted to experience how education is different in another part of the world. And because I had people that I knew that had gone to this particular country and were sharing these beautiful experiences, I thought I'd want to go there as well.
And once you were there, what were the things that sort of lived up to your expectations, and what was different from what you expected? It could be good or bad, but just different from what sitting in India you had expectations of, or imagining your life there, and what fit and what didn't.
Yeah, I think what lived up to my expectation is just like the quality of education, right from the infrastructure to the kind of information that you had access to. Like you could be a student and you could have access to so many different journals, so many different research and published work that and guidance to go read this or that was just phenomenal. The medium of instruction used to be very, very collaborative. Like the professors would used to come and used to discuss every single topic as opposed to okay, this chapter, this topic, I have to sort of teach today, and you're supposed to take notes, and then you're supposed to give exams. So I don't think it was all of that lived up to my expectation. I think the one thing that that did not live up to my expectation was obviously just the culture. It was a culture shock. Like for someone from a city like Bikaner to first come to Bombay was a culture adjustment in itself, and then going from India again to the US was another culture shock on a variety of different levels. That was one, and the second thing is you had to do everything on your own, which means because I had received a graduate assistantship, which meant that I was working with a professor and helping them in their research work, finding articles for them, correcting some papers for them, but that alone didn't sort of make up for my living expenses over there. So I was working in a cafeteria making sandwiches and serving them and ringing behind a counter. So that was a different experience altogether. I don't think my parents would have loved the idea of their daughter who's done engineering to stand behind a sandwich counter and make sandwiches for students there. But I think that to me was a very liberating experience, because it allowed me to be independent and it allowed me to sort of fend for myself. So I was earning my own money, and I was making sure my living expenses were taken care of over there, and everything else, right? Like when you step out of your comfort zone where you are so protected by your parents or your relatives, everything from managing a household to managing your own accounts to making small decisions every single day. Should I spend on this or should I save this for because it's the end of the month today? And my next salary won't come until after 15 days from today. So small little, decisions that one has to take were, shape the person, you become eventually. So yeah.
Right. So Nandan has the question for you that, okay, you've done all this, you've done engineering, you've done your master's in that, you went to the US. ये impact कहाँ से आया? Like what was this idea of switching over to the impact sector? Like where did that come from?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'll preface it with a disclaimer. This worked for me, and it is what I had the appetite to take risk for. So don't take this as a gospel truth. But I will share what my experience was and what my thought process was, Nandan. So when I was in the US and I was in consulting, I was working with two clients who were going through mergers, and one bank was acquiring the other bank, and I was tasked with a project of figuring out what technology systems should stay, what technology systems should get retired, what technology systems should completely be canned out of that merger and acquisition process. And every single day doing of creating those Excel sheets, creating those PowerPoint presentations, going and presenting in front of the clients, gave me good learning. I honed in on a lot of technical skills, like how to present in front of clients. I learned how to work and create Excel models. I learned how to create Word documents and whatnot. But at the end of the day, when I slept, I said, like, so what? Like, I'm doing all of this, but what's happening after this? Okay, so one bank will acquire the other bank, and then whose life am I impacting? And so that was the point that started triggering this unrest in my mind. And every time I came back to India, on vacation, and as I had mentioned, my mother used to be working on these different projects, and I used to go visit these different villages with her, and I saw how beautiful it was for some of these nonprofits to be working at the grassroots level, empowering these kids to find out who they were, or helping them with resources so that they could become best versions of themselves. And that to me was very empowering. After each of these visits, I used to feel so satisfied, and I wanted to do something something along those lines. But I also knew I couldn't be a teacher. I had very little patience for standing in front of 30, 40 kids and answering incessant questions. So I said, okay, I can't do that, but I have acquired skills over 5 years of being an engineer and being being a consultant in a consulting firm. How do I translate some of those transferable skills into this sector? Because this was one sector that could change the entire landscape of what India could be in, maybe not in my lifetime, but in the next few decades or few years. So I wanted to be a part of that change, which is how I took the decision to come back to India and work in the education sector.
Right. So, and this, so another follow-up question on impact came from Gursimran, which is that how is it that if you work in non-profit, you're going to be absolutely poor and you require help to survive, or how does one make a decent living and marry that with the idea of work, of trying to do good or having an impact?
Yeah.
Are they two opposite things, that you have to only have one dhoti or one sari and just make your life with that if you're going on impact, or is there some or other ways to sort of manage both and live decently while doing good?
No, I think they don't have to be on the opposite end of the stick, Amrut. I think you can definitely marry your passion with, how you want to live your life. So just to answer the question, working in non-profit sector or impact sector does not mean that you do not get paid. It's not a voluntary service. It's not a voluntary job. It does not mean that you will be dependent on your parents for the rest of your life. You do get a salary, which is why people like me who were fundraising fundraise for the salaries of these individuals who are working in nonprofits. So the quantum of salary is obviously not equivalent to what a for-profit organization or a corporate organization would pay, but it is decent enough for you to manage the lifestyle that you are used to. And to put some contextual information, nonprofit would pay close to 70th percentile of what your 70% equivalent of what your corporate or a company salary would
So
be.
for X amount of experience, if I could earn 100 in a for-profit, I will earn 70 in a
70
non-profit,
rupees
right?
in a
Okay.
non-profit.
In one
So
of these good non-profits,
all the all the non-profits that are run professionally, when I say professionally, they operate as an organization, they operate with systems and processes, with governance structures built in. Those non-profits do have funds to pay for professionals. The things have changed over the years, right? Like the roles that exist in non-profits didn't exist like 2 to 3 decades ago. If you
right.
think of a role which is an impact analyst, the role of an impact analyst would be to look at all the different projects that a nonprofit is running and identify what inputs have gone into this program and what outputs have come out of this program and put them on nice pictorial representative charts, is what an impact analyst would do for a nonprofit. Such a role did not exist 2 to 3 decades ago. If you think of fundraiser, this role did not exist 2 to 3 decades ago in a nonprofit, because people who wanted to willingly donate would donate to an organization through friends and family and networks, and that organization would sustain itself in the limited means that they have. But fundraising itself has become very professional role, which means intentionally organizations create that role so that these individuals can go out and raise funds for their organization to run their programs. So a lot of roles have evolved, and so has the nonprofit and social sector landscape. So yeah, I mean, short answer is you do get a salary, you do get,
Right.
you can manage your lifestyle comfortably. Does that mean you can go out every single night to a restaurant and party? Maybe not. But can you do that once every week? Sure, you can.
Right. Makes sense. I liked that last part. So you made it real for everyone listening. So Nafisa and Kajal had some questions, which if I paraphrase, so we have this Venn diagram, right, that I described, where you look at the intersection between something you're passionate about, or something that you feel, a purpose that you feel connected to. So it could be a passion or a purpose, and something that you're good at, with something the world finds valuable. So now, if you were to look at your job today, and think about, put that in the context of yourself in this Venn diagram, what sort of made you into this job? Like, was it primarily purpose driven? Was it primarily that this thing is valuable and you had built up skills that could get you there? Did you have a great competitive advantage in something that sort of allows you to kick ass at what you're doing now? How's does this framework sort of make sense for how you make decisions even today, and maybe decide what to do next?
I think it's a combination of a little bit of all, Amrut. I think when I started on this journey towards finding purpose, I don't think I had a very sure answer of what my purpose in life was, and it's a journey even today. Right. So and I think it was more or less a function of having graduated and hit a turning point in my life with the career, where I was feeling a bit lost, not sure where to go. And I think that was okay. So, and at that time, I had the liberty of trying as many different things that I could, obviously, without wasting time. So I took these jobs so that they incrementally added to my overall professional journey. But I think the process or the journey that I went through, shaped me into the individual that I have become. So I let the intuition guide me at some points in time, so that, I felt like I was in the most fulfilled place with the job that I was doing. So I don't think, I mean, one thing that I'd say is I think it's okay to be unsure about your purpose in life. I think the thing is that people should know to enjoy the journey. the only advice I have is don't rush. Like every little path that you go through will lead you to somewhere. And now that when I look back, I'm able to connect the dot and they all make sense. Now, if I talk about the job I am in today, which is leading a recruitment firm, never in my life I would have imagined to be working in a recruitment firm. But the overall vision of this organization is how can we help individuals unlock their professional potential. Now,
sounds very familiar, right?
Yes, it does. If I connect the dots back to where I started my own journey from Bikaner, I think it makes a whole lot of sense now, because I did not get the opportunity to expose myself to other occupations, other professions out there, which is why I feel so compelled. And this job that I'm in, I love it a whole lot more, because I'm able to level the playing field for a lot of individuals who, no matter where they come from, will get a sure opportunity or a shot at applying for jobs that different organizations have for them. So I think now that I look back in retrospect, different jobs that led me to where I am, I feel passionate about, because it almost feels like I'm contributing back to many more Mridvikas in many Bikaner-like cities that don't really know how to go about finding their way in their professional journey.
So, I mean, through your answer, what I'm getting is that for you, at least, the purpose part seems quite important. Like whatever you do, you want to align yourself in a direction that you feel motivated by that, and that's what gives you a lot of energy to go out and excel at whatever you're doing. Is if it sort of fits in with some north star of purpose that you can agree with.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, Amrut. I think just the alignment of purpose, passion, and values has been super important for me in every job that I have opted for. So, and I have, and because I have put that at the center, I have almost loved every job that I have taken up, which is why it's just worked out well for me.
Great. So I'm going to now switch gears, talking less about your journey through and your decision making, and move a little bit more abstract, a little higher level, and think about what lessons you've learned through all of this. And this question, I really love this question, and this is asked by Kirti here. Is that what advice would you give to yourself at 16, right? If you could sort of knowing everything you know now and sort of moving yourself back to their age roughly, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self?
Yeah, I thought about this because I do get asked this question often. So I think there are four things that I'd say here. One is read more. Anything and everything you can lay hands on, because that exposes you to a different world altogether. And I am trying to make up for not reading enough in my growing up years through my kids. Now I give them everything and anything, and I'm super proud that they are reading more than I could have ever imagined. So read more is the first advice that I'd give to my younger self. The second one is around focus on one thing at a time, because you can have it all, but not all at once. What I mean by that is that at one point in time, I felt that I was multitasking, almost like feeling like an expert, but not sort of getting a whole lot out of it. I got myself involved in 3 projects, and I was, not married at that point in time, and I had all the time in the world to myself. So I thought, let's just keep myself busy, and I thought I could manage. but I was wrong. I felt overwhelmed. I thought I was literally multitasking too much. And at the end of the day, I realized that none of those 3 projects were my true passions. And so I think the second thing I would say is just focus on one thing at a time, because even though you want to have it all, just have a little bit more patience, that not all of it will come at once. The third thing is around plan ahead in time, but be okay if that plan changes, because you can plan ahead, because planning ahead always gives you clearer direction of where you want to go. It drives you, it motivates you, and the planning process also teaches you a whole lot. However, one thing I've learned is never get fixated on a plan, because plans most definitely will always change. So just be prepared for it. With how changes come along. And the last one was around I think taking a leap of faith, and taking a leap of faith in yourself more than anything else. Because the way I looked at each of my decisions, I always thought of them as like, I have nothing to lose, but everything to gain with everything that I'm trying to do. If I fail, I'll end up becoming smarter. If I succeed, I'll gain even more self-confidence and financial rewards thereof. But you would never. So one thing that allowed me to be where I am at is just not limiting myself to follow something that was traditional, or because someone had already tested it before, I must do that. So those are the 4 things that I would tell myself if I was much younger.
Great. You also mentioned a lot about failure and rejection. So you said you applied to all of these jobs and you got rejected. And so far a lot of the speakers that have come in have all have had like sort of a golden touch key. IIM gaya, fir IIM se, have managed to hit all the top institutions, and they spoke about how the best is being in the best is very important. And
do want their kids to go to IITs and the IIMs and these pedigree institutions. And over a course of last 15 years, I have hired from these institutions, and I've hired people who are not from these institutions. And I have been pleasantly surprised to see people who actually do come from other places have done much better than people who have come from the Ivy League colleges. And I don't know what the reason is, but I think what I feel also closely connected is because you did not go through these institutions, there was this hunger to do better. There was this hunger to do to learn more that you otherwise would not have learned, because you sort of theoretically maybe lost out on those opportunities. And so I think the very fact that we place so much of importance on these institutions or these blue chip companies or these degrees is almost something that I'm very, very disconnected by, because I think it is the onus of learning should be placed more on the individual and their own desire and hunger to learn, and whether that person ends up by the by de facto being in one of these places is just a matter of fact as opposed to anything more than that.
So then, so if it is, if it's not necessarily these best institutions, Akshay and Vasanta have roughly similar questions. So then, what do you think it is about you that sort of got you to excellence? Like, is it, was it about any skills, any qualities that you had, any habits that you have? What do you think are those things that sort of propelled you to excellence in your life?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I always try to do is just be on this constant journey of learning. You can never learn enough, which means that right from my first job, I've always never stopped asking questions, and I've always tried to be adding on these incremental skills. So let's say from my first engineering job, I learned how to code, which gave me a logical framework to problem solve things. To when I became a consultant, it helped me develop skills around client management, stakeholder management, presentation, and a lot of technical skills around Excel modeling, PowerPoint, Word documentation, etc. To when I came to doing fundraising, it helped me hone in on skills on negotiations, presenting a proposal, talking with high net worth individuals and CXO level people in the organization, to where I am now, managing teams and making sure that the organization can function as a well-oiled machinery. So across each of these different jobs, I have always aspired to add in these incremental skill set that I did not have at that point in time, which is what has always kept on going. And today, like, there's one thing that I haven't learned so far, which is how to do marketing. And so I'm in a constant look out for wherever I can find people, or wherever I can find individuals, or even like courses that allow me to learn the ropes of marketing, or learn the ropes of how to market yourself better.
So you think that the thing that really drove you to excellence was this sort of hunger of lifelong learning, like always trying to learn and propel yourself forward that way. We have a couple of questions coming in from Facebook also. One is that what do you think about switching gears midway in your career? Like, even because you feel like a misfit in the current career, even if you've chosen the career, right? So I think sometimes what's happening is that now we are saying that, okay, beta, you go choose your career, and let's say I made that choice, but then I made that choice, but then it turns out it's not a good choice, and it probably. So now what do I do? Like, when do I give up, and when do I and sort of like giving up is also defeat, right? Like, how do I think about these things? I think that's one genre of questions that come into us.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, right, like not succeeding, at least the way I took it was, if I didn't succeed at anything, if I didn't succeed at the decision I had taken, I just thought I became smarter and I won't do that. I won't make that mistake again. But if I succeeded at something, it just made me more self-confident of the decision that I had taken. So one way to sort of look at taking a decision and not succeeding at it is not as a failure, but almost as a learning opportunity of what not to do the next time you're presented with taking a decision like that. So that lens has always helped me take decisions fearlessly and without thinking what the world would say about it, or no one else has traversed this path
right
so far.
But what's your thought that if you've made a decision, you're on a path, right? And there is going to be some path dependency. So even your journey, even though you took so many turns, each turn was based on where you came from. So there is some path dependency there, but then there's also some ability for you to change, take decisions. So how do you, if someone is in this situation that they have, let's say it's their first job and now they suddenly realize, I don't like it. What would be your advice to this person? What should they do?
Yeah, so I found myself several times over there, and there's one exercise much similar to the concentric circles or that intersection circle exercise that you do, and that's of
Right.
this genius quadrant, which almost can be imagined in form of a 2 by 2 matrix,
Mm-hmm.
wherein there's a bucket which allows you to list down all the things that you do not like to do. You do it because you are expected to do in the job, but
Right.
do not like to do it. For example, can I write a press release? Yes. Do I want to write 1,000 press releases? The short answer is no. Right.
Right.
So list down all the things that you do today, but you don't like doing. Then the next
Mm.
bucket is people think you are good at, and you do it because they are part of your job, but you're not really excited about them.
Mm.
Then there's another bucket which basically you like doing, but you like doing only for X percentage of your job's time, and not like 100% of the time. And then there's another bucket which wherein you can list down all the things that you would do even if no one paid you to do that. And I've
Right.
always tried to sort of like find at least 80% of my job should be in that genius bucket, which I love doing, and I would do it even if no one pays me to do it. And that sort of always helped me identify the kind of jobs or the kind of roles that I might be good at.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool. That's a pretty cool idea as well. Um, there is another one, I guess, is from someone who's slightly younger, who's saying that what if I am academically excellent in one subject, but I like another subject. So let's say I'm really good. This sort of in our Venn diagram, it's between competitive advantage and passion, right? Like I'm really good at maths, but I don't like it. But what I really like is humanities and I'm not so great in that, right? Like, so what do I do now?
Yeah, I mean, if I were her, I would try and understand what do I mean when I say I'm not good at it, but I like it. I mean, do you like the idea of humanities, or do you and you're not good at the grades that you're receiving in humanities? I think it requires a little bit more digging deeper into what in humanities does she like, but she feels she's not good at. If
Right.
she's not good at just because of the grades that she's receiving, she should continue to sort of pursue it further, because I've always been disconnected with the grading system that our education system has. So
Right.
she should talk to a lot more people in humanities. She should try and figure out uh, what about humanity she is extremely passionate about, and continue having these conversations without giving up too soon.
Great. I want to now transition to another section, just because, like, unlike our other speakers, you are sitting in a recruitment firm, right? So you have sort of a bird's eye view on what might be going on in the world of jobs more than some of the rest of us. And I wanted you to shed some light on. So this is now in only the quadrant of valuable, right? Like what the world considers valuable. So what are the jobs, in your opinion, being a recruiter for all of these companies? Like, what do you think are the jobs that are going to thrive, or that are going to become more valuable or gain in value, let's say 5 or 10 years from now? And the way that we've been thinking about that in this course is thinking about it in terms of supply demand, right? Like, in what job is the demand going to go up, but it's hard enough to create jobs about that the supply doesn't just explode, right? For example, Mayank is also an engineer like you and I, only he's about 15 years later, but the salaries for engineers from, like, our kind of colleges like Thadumal or RAIT, he went to Pune, similar kind of college, and got into those Infosys, TCS type things, but their wages had not increased by much. Like, I think the inflation was increasing by a compounded rate of less than 2%. If you look at how much they're paying someone as a starting salary. So then that brought up the question that, okay, so demand was still there, but then it was so easy to create these engineers that suddenly supply exploded, and you had this problem. So now just trying to think and helping them avoid missteps like that. That what jobs do you think are going to be more in demand as we go in the future, and are going to be hard enough that only like you can become really, or it becomes really valuable that only a few people become good at doing that?
Yeah, I think I would have responded to this question differently if it were before March 2020, because then we were all hit by this thing called COVID.
Right.
And so I'll have to use this lens in responding to this question. And the in-demand roles that we've been getting requisition for are roles that are digital in nature, and they could be done remotely. And if I were to go by the role titles, some of these would be roles in product management, data science, cybersecurity, digital marketing, customer success, sales operations, and design, the UI UX. Like all of these different role titles have suddenly surged, ever since we got hit by this tsunami. Content writing is another one that's right up there. So these are the kind of roles that employers are hiring for. But to your second question, which was around how do we make sure that young professionals build the requisite skills that are needed for surviving the next 5 years to a decade, is probably things that our education system doesn't explicitly acknowledge, and these are things that actually employers explicitly ask for. And these are things like learning mindset, result orientation, empathy, curiosity, or gender sensitivity, conflict management. Like
can you talk about some of them, because just so that we understand them a little bit better, because it may not be a part of the regular conversation that these guys are having.
Yeah, for sure. Like for example, you always work in an organization in teams. And in teams, regardless of who you are, there are going to be conversations where you are expected to resolve conflict. No one necessarily teaches us how to resolve conflicts while growing up in school, or even during our college days. And conflict resolution doesn't mean, or confronting someone doesn't mean that you are disrespecting them because you have a different point of view. It only means that you are both trying to put your point of view at the table, so that you as a team can arrive at the best possible solution that's useful for the team. But no one teaches us that. And so what happens in workplaces is, when people have to confront each other, either they are subservient and they would say yes to the loudest voice on the table, or and there will be a group of people who will basically side whoever's shouting the loudest on the table, or people would almost see this as it's my way or the highway, right? Like if I'm not able to influence you with my line of thought, or if I'm not able to disagree with you and still commit to doing something, then it's a bad thing. But no one teaches us these things as we are graduating out of school, or as we are graduating out of college. And this is one of the most important things that employers actually want. In fact, some of the employers have instituted ways in which they test for whether a person can resolve conflict in the interview process itself. So they'll give these candidates an opposing point of view, and they'll almost expect this person to manage the confrontation in the most respectful way that allows them to see whether this person has the ability to survive in a situation where he's not in agreement with rest of the group or rest of the team. So that was just one example. But Amrut, if you think of when organizations decide to sort of like let go of people, they don't necessarily let go of people because they were bad at Excel, or they they couldn't make a PowerPoint, right? Like people are asked to go, or people have to be let go of from an organization for the reasons that come out as they were not a good culture fit. They did not align with the company vision. And
right.
at the bottom of all of these phrases or statement is lack of skills that our atmosphere or our environment doesn't sort of build on, which is vulnerability or assertiveness or transparency or empathy and collaboration. And I think a lot of these skills are going to make individuals stand apart from the rest if they are able to invest in themselves today for the next few years.
So you're saying, in some way, are you saying that it is almost as important as acing that test or doing that to build these skills, or maybe you might argue it's more important to build these skills of empathy, of conflict management that you mentioned, then it is even to score like a 99 or whatever that is.
I'm actually saying it's more important than acing your tests, and it's more important than yes, the world today selects you or rejects you based on those standardized tests, but that's only going to get you inside the organization. Like
right.
How you sustain in that organization, how you grow in that organization is all of these other things that people often call as soft skills, but to me they are not soft skills. I think they are we do a disservice by calling them soft skills. I think they are the real hard skills that everyone should learn at as early in their lives as they possibly can.
Okay, lovely. I think we're almost out of time. I want to I just want to ask one or two last things. One, there was a discussion going on in one of the groups which I want you to touch upon, is that how is it different to be a female CEO than sort of a male CEO? And what are the challenges that are particular to you than, let's say, to me, and how you manage to navigate that?
Sure. Thanks for raising that. I think it's a very important topic, and I think gender sensitivity is something that is as important and more relevant in workplaces than it was a few years ago. I have been plain fortunate to work in organizations that haven't discriminated on basis of gender. And right from Teach for India to even when I was working at Mindseed, I worked with both the founders, Amrit and Prasad. And I think I always had the opportunity to put my point of view across on the table and not be discounted for being a female to present that point of view. And more often than not,
you would dare.
more often than not, my point of view was opposing than most of the men in the room. And even today, when I'm at Shortlist, about 60% of our leadership team is female dominant. So I think I've also consciously chosen to be part of organizations where the men in the organizations have given equal and due importance to the female point of view. So I think I've just been plain lucky, but I am probably the exception than the norm. And the question that you raised is probably a more grave one, where the gender sensitivity is not embedded into the fabric of the organization. And the only thing I would say, and I can't say from experience because I've never been in those instances, but the only thing I would say is always sit at the table. I mean, when I say sit at the table, always put your point of view across, even though you think it's being shot down, or even though you think it's not being taken into consideration at that point in time. It's only it's only matter of time that you will make yourself heard. But if you stop voicing your opinion, if you stop participating, then nothing's going to change any which ways. So the only advice I have is just like sit on the table, which means always speak your mind and and always participate no matter what.
Great, thanks for that. I think we've taken up a fair amount of your time. I just want to leave you with one thought is sort of the reason why I was always confident that that you would do great things is what I would say. You said a lifelong curiosity for learning. I would just say that you're relentless, and I think that ability or it was whether it was a habit or a skill or a combination of the two is that if you wanted to do something you would do it, and that is in those list of things that you were or skills you were talking about, particularly after interacting with you, I would that's gone up in my ranking as one of the things that I look for. If someone is absolutely relentless regardless of what is the obstacle in front of them, if they keep going through, if they keep at least plugging away at it, I think that's a huge sign that people will succeed. And I would say that's what always made me confident that that you would do great things wherever you go. So thanks again, Mrits, for taking the time out and hanging out with all of us and giving us some of your wisdom. So that we might make better decisions as we go forward.
No, the pleasure was all mine, Amrut. Thank you so much. And I'd leave you by saying, like, if any of your students do want to reach out and have specific questions about the professions I've chosen to be in, I'm more than happy and available to answer their questions even after the session's over. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thanks so much. You want to just take a couple of questions from them now, if they have any? Hello? Maybe she's gone. All right. Okay. Thanks, guys. If you want to...
Ritvika is here.
Oh,
she's here.
Okay. She froze up. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So does anyone have any other questions that you want to ask her yourself in your voice rather than through me? If so, you can do that. Otherwise, you can get in touch with her. If you want to get in touch with Manju or and we will connect you to Ritvika. Are there any questions? No, doesn't look like. All right. Thanks, Mrit, so much.
Thanks,
So
Mrit.
much. Bye. Take care.
Bye.
See you.